Hello everyone, it's Shannon here. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, we are going to play with the new Stitchable Borders dies from Waffle Flower Crafts. We're going to combine them with variegated floss to create these clean and simple cards. These are all the Stitchable border dies versus the Stitchable Squares, Circles, Hearts, and Zigzags. The Hearts, Circles, and Squares also have a little tag that's included in this set as well. But we're just going to use the Hearts today, and I'm going to combine them with this variegated floss. Variegated floss is a really beautiful floss, comes in lots of different colors, but basically variegated just means that it changes from one color to the next, all on one thread. So it's pretty cool. This one changes from a pink to a red to a maroon. Now I'm going to start with a small panel. This panel is 4 by 5 1/4, so a little bit smaller than an A2 panel, and it's made from 110-pound light pink cardstock. I definitely recommend using a heavyweight cardstock for these stitchable dies. So I just placed the die on my cardstock and used a couple pieces of purple tape to hold it in place while I ran it through my die cutting machine. And I did run it a couple times through, but these dies cut really, really beautifully. So most of these little negative pieces are just kind of falling right out, but Waffle Flower created this brilliant die here. It's the A2 piercing panel die. This die helps you get those last little pieces of little tiny negative circles out, and you just place your panel onto that die and rub it, and that will help to pop out all those little remaining negative circles. So now I'm going to move on to actually stamping my sentiment. I definitely recommend stamping your sentiment before you do your stitching, because if you mess it up at all, you haven't wasted that whole panel that you did your stitching on. So I recommend doing it first. So I am also going to do some heat embossing. So I did apply some anti-static powder, and I'm going to stamp the sentiment a couple times in VersaFine Onyx black ink, and then I will dip it into some clear embossing powder. I recommend heat embossing this just because you're going to be holding this panel a lot while you do your cross stitching, and you don't want to kind of have any of the oils or any little moisture from your hands to cause that ink to kind of bleed or anything. Now that my sentiment is stamped, I'm ready to move on to my stitching. I've already gone ahead and cut a piece of variegated floss. It's up at the top of my panel. And what's important when you work with this variegated floss is being mindful of the end that you cut. So this light pink end is the end I just cut, so I'm going to thread that through my needle, and then I'm going to tie a knot on the other end. So not the end that I just cut. And the other end is kind of more of a maroon color. That's the darker color. The only reason why you want to kind of be mindful of all this is just so you can be very consistent. So when you run out of thread and you end a row, the new thread that you cut can kind of start at the same color that you just ended. So I hope that makes sense. It's just for consistency. You don't have to worry about it if it doesn't bother you, but I do like to I like to have that gradation consistent. So I've already gone ahead and tied a double knot. Now I'm going to feed my thread through the first row, kind of towards the end of the first row. This is just a knot technique that I learned from watching Nina's Cross Stitching for Beginners video. I found it to be a really helpful video. And now that I've got that knot in place, I'm going to start to do my first row of half stitches. And my half stitches, I like to start at the lower left corner and then stitch up to the upper right. So I'm going to continue with this stitching till I get all of this row completed. And this row is a little it's not all the way through. As you can see, there's a break in the top of the heart, and I just kind of skipped over that and then moved to the next opening for my half stitch. So I'm almost done here, just a couple more stitches to go, and then I will address that knot. And while I finish this row up, I just want to point out that I am using all 6 threads, and I am also using a 22 needle. So I'm just finished up that stitch here, and I'll turn my panel over, and you can see that the stitches have kind of held that tail end from the end in place. And so now I can just trim this knot off, and I don't have to worry about it unraveling or anything, but it will also make my panel completely or very smooth, as smooth as you can get a cross-stitched panel. So now I'm going to complete this row by doing my other half stitches, and this time I'm going to start at the lower right and stitch up to the upper left. So I'm just going to continue doing my half stitches here till I have this completed, till I have this top row completed. And this is a very repetitive process, so I went ahead and jumped ahead, and I'm just finishing up my last stitch here, and now I'm going to move down to the next row. And again, I'm starting at the lower right and stitching to the upper left, because that's just how I like to start for my first half stitches. And now that I've got that first stitch in, I'm going to continue with this process till I get the whole row done, and basically repeat this process, go all the way with my first half stitches and then go back with my other half stitches to complete that cross. And you can see here I'm finishing up these couple of rows. Now I've kind of run out of floss, so I'm going to do this last stitch here, and then I'm going to turn my panel over. I'm just going to show you how I address these ends. I'm going to kind of stitch this end back through some of my previous stitches. Once I get it kind of fed through, I'll pull it all the way through. That's going to hold that end in place, that tail end of the thread, and then I will grab my scissors and just trim off that excess thread. And since I ran out of floss, I got to cut some more, so I just unraveled some here from my spool. Then I will grab that cut end. Now remember, that cut end is the end we're going to feed through the needle, so I'm going to grab it here, and this time it's that maroon end, and I'm going to feed it through that needle. And then the opposite end is the end that I'm going to tie in a double knot. And again, the reason why we do it this way, or the reason you want to be mindful of this, is just so you can be consistent, because now when I start up this next row of stitches, it kind of ended off on the maroon, and we're going to come back with the maroon. So it just keeps everything very consistent. So I'm going to continue this process till I make my way through all 3 hearts. I'm just finishing up my third and final heart here with some final stitches. And once I finish this last stitch, I'll then turn my panel over, feed my needle through some of my previous stitches, and that will kind of take care of that end, and then just trim it with my scissors. And here's the finished panel. As you can see, our hearts are very stripy. We kind of have these horizontal stripes. Now I'm going to show you a different way to stitch with the variegated floss to get a different look. This time we're going to do full stitches, which is my favorite way to cross stitch, but we're not going to stitch straight across. We're going to stitch in a diagonal rows. So I'm going to start here in the corner, and I've already tied my knot, and I'm just going to start from the lower left to the upper right. And once I finish that stitch, I'm going to now place my needle right below, so it's now the lower right, and I'm going to stitch to the upper left to complete my cross stitch. So I've made a full stitch here, and now I'm ready to stitch the next full stitch at a diagonal from that. So I'm going to go to my next kind of X area, start at the lower left, stitch up to the upper right, and then again I'll go down to the lower right and then to the upper left to make my X. And I find this full stitch is a little bit easier because it's a completed image almost. It helps me to design. It might help you if you get kind of confused here to actually make the little X's on your cardstock so you know where you're going to stitch. I actually do that on the next panel, so you can see me do that here, and I've done it in a previous video. It's a tip I share for designing, kind of creating your own cross stitch patterns for these stitchables. So now I'm going to move on to my next kind of diagonal row, and I'm going to kind of work in a zigzag. So now I'm going to work down, and then once I finish that row, then I'll work back up. So kind of zigzagging through diagonally till I get this heart completed. And we've only completed a couple of rows already, but you can see the shift in color already happening. That's the beauty of this variegated floss. It's very little effort and you get such a big bang, and it's really a great solution for these border dies because they really allow that kind of change of color to really happen. So here is the finished panel, and you can see here instead of like a horizontal stripes, we have these diagonal stripes, which I think is really kind of cool on the hearts. So now I'm going to move on to a third panel, and I use the second heart border die for this panel, kind of die cut it at an angle, and I'm going to actually draw on this panel because this is the one I get a little mixed up on. So I actually draw the X's with my pencil here. You can see where I'm drawing them, and I'm making sure that I don't put an X on those areas I don't want to stitch, which is kind of the arc between the top of the heart and between each heart, because you want a little bit of separation there, and it's easy to kind of get mixed up and start stitching everywhere, which is what I did before. And so I'm going to start in the lower left corner. And again, for this panel, I'm going to do full stitches and I'm going to do them at a diagonal. And here is basically the end result. I'm just going to finish up with this last heart here with my last final stitches. And you can see we have another great like kind of shift in color. I definitely recommend doing the diagonal for this than straight across. You're going to get more of a change, kind of a change that flows better with the design of that die. So now I'm ready to finish these up by adhering them. I'm just going to use some liquid glue, just place liquid glue on the back side of the panel, and I do like to put a little bit, a tiny amount, on some of the stitching just to kind of hold that down and make sure that's nice and adhered to my card base. And I'll just stick that down, hold it for a little bit till that glue sets, and here is the finished card. And I'll just hold it to the camera so you can get a good look at that design. I really love how clean and simple that one turned out. Here is the one where we did the full stitches at a diagonal, and again we get those diagonal stripes. And then our first one here on the pink where we did half stitches and we did it straight across, so we have more of these horizontal stripes. I hope you guys enjoyed today's cards and video. If you'd like any more information on the products I use, please check out the links below in the description. And if you like this video, I'd so appreciate it if you consider subscribing to my channel and leaving me a thumbs up. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.